and some of the part of that equation was very similar to what you see here. There was this factor eta, which had a slightly different expression, but it has been substituted by this expression here. And then the value of alpha has to be determined based on which kind of cross section you're talking about and which axis of buckling you're talking about. Okay, and lambda, of course, is your lambda basically is the slenderness value that basically governs whether a column is more susceptible to buckling or yielding first. Okay, so larger the lambda, the column is more susceptible to buckling. That is flexural buckling. This entire chapter is on flexural buckling, entire section. And if the lambda value is small, that means if it is less than 1, then it is more likely to have yielding followed by buckling. Okay. So this is non-dimensional. Even the other one is non-dimensional. So I won't emphasize too much on non-dimensional part of it. KL by R is the other expression, which is also referred to as slenderness sometimes. So you have to be careful which one are you talking about. So KL by R, it has, so it is not normalized slenderness, but this one is more of a normalized kind of a slenderness value. Yeah, so lambda basically governs your relationship between FCC, that is Euler buckling stress, versus Fy. That is the relationship that is governed by lambda value, or the, yeah. Okay, how do you get the alpha value? The alpha value depends on the buckling class, whether it is A, B, C, or D. So based on what kind of cross section you have, if it's an I section, rolled I section, and then based on what thicknesses you have, and based on which axis of buckling we are talking about, you have to pick A, B, C, or D class of buckling. Okay, and once you have the class of buckling known, then you use that information to pick the correct alpha value. So alpha value will be, if it's a D class, then the alpha value will be equal to 0.76. That is this one. So the predicted column capacity will be much smaller in case of class D curve. Then I had compared in the previous class with what we have in India and what they have in the US. So the US curves had come out of this SSRC research, Structural Stability Research Council, SSRC. So they had come up, they had published some 3 curves, and then later on they had published even 4 curves. So there are these 4 different curves, and if you compare our curves with their curves, so their curves in a way encompass the Indian curves. So there are 4 Indian curves, 4 curves in the Indian code. There are 3 curves as per SSRC, and I think the 4th one, I don't remember where it was, but I think there were total 4 curves. The 4th one was even smaller than this. So eventually, they did not adopt those 3 curves or 4 curves in the American code. In American code, they have a single curve which looks like this, which is slightly unconservative in comparison to the Indian codes, or you can say that most of the Indian code predictions are slightly conservative in comparison to the American code. Okay. Okay. So, so with this, we have completed the discussion on residual stresses and imperfections. Now, there was one question that I had asked in the very beginning, and in fact, this question was asked in the introductory chapter also. And the question was, why is it that when we talk about compression members, we have to account for residual stresses, but not when we talk about tension members? Does anybody have an answer to that? Or should I ask that as a quiz or something? So we had an elaborate discussion on the effect of residual stresses on the capacity of a column, right? But we never even mentioned residual stresses when we're talking about tension capacity of a member, of a steel member. Why is it so?
Because maybe the reason is in compression, buckling capacity is getting affected by the residual stresses, whereas in tension members, that's not the case.
Yes, that's correct answer. Maybe I can ask somebody else to elaborate, or if they were able to follow it, what Lohit was saying. They can expand a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to ask one by one then. Aditya?
Yes, sir.
Do you want to give it? Yeah. So did you understand the question?
Yes, sir. Sir, basically, sir, sir, uh, compressive force is a disturbing force, where a tension force is a stabilizing force. That's why we consider that residual stress effect in the compression more as compared to tension.
What is the link? So if it's a disturbing force, why residual stress only? Like, you have to connect the link between the two things. Both statements are true, but how do you jump from one statement to other statement? That link is not there. Want to expand further? No? Okay, Amulya? You may have to unmute your mic. Amulya? Oh, in the effort to unmute the mic, she might have clicked the disconnect button. Okay, Asadullah, you want to try?
Yes, sir. Actually, the compression also, in compression, there is buckling also. That may be
Yes.
predominant before yielding, but there is no chance in tension. The tension always fails in yielding only. No buckling chances there.
So why does it buckle before yielding in compression? What has got residual stress got to do with that? See, you gave an answer, but you did not mention residual stress anywhere. Yeah. No? Vishal?
So I have no specific answers to this.
Dipsy?
Rather,
Dipsy Sinha? Oh, what happened? Oh, Amulya is back. Huh, Amulya? You accidentally disconnected yourself. You need to just unmute your mic. I
Yes,
cannot
sir.
unmute. Yeah.
Low connected.
Yeah, tell me.
I'm not very much clear about it, sir.
Okay. Dipsy, you want to try? Unmute your mic, please. Are you able to hear me? Hello? No. Dipsy, I'm going to come back to you. Somehow there is some issue, it seems. Harish?
Sir,
Yeah.
In the tension members, when we apply the tension, the imperfections and all, they may be, they may not cause any destabilizing effects, sir. Because
I'm not
they may
talking about imperfections. I'm talking about residual stress only.
So, in the tension, sorry, in the background also flange, in the junction portion, there will be tension also.
Yes.
That will be helping in the tension members. Whereas when we apply compression in the compression member, that would cause.
No, but you have both tension and compression. Residual stresses are they consist of both tension and compression. So if it helps in tension, or if it affects the compression capacity, it should also affect the tension capacity, just because of the virtue of being tension and compression stresses. But that may not really be the final answer.
Maybe the stress distribution will become uniform now, sir, in the tension members.
Why would it become uniform? Until yielding, the stresses, until the first yielding happens, the stresses are, all the stresses increase by the same amount, right? Whether you apply tension or compression. If you apply compression, all the stresses move by the same amount in that direction, compression direction. If you apply tension, then all the stresses will move by the same amount in the tension direction. Okay, I'll move on. Haripriya?
Sir, the stress distribution due to the residual stresses, it predominantly helps in tension members.
Helps in tension members. Why?
While
You're saying
applying
You're saying residual stresses are helping tension members.
the stress, the distribution patterns which helps in
Why?
tension member.
Why?
It act like pre-stressed, so it helps in
No,
while
there is no priest. See, it acts like pre-stress. That is just an example I might have given. See, what happens? Some portion of the cross section is in tension. Some portion of the cross section is in compression. So, why would it help or hurt? I mean, it's basically they are all cancelling each other out. Indira?
No, sir. Not sure.
Somebody has to give me an answer. Premchand?
Not clarity on about it, sir.
Not acceptable, sir. At least try. At least try. You should have thought of something, right? Yeah.
As compression members are destabilization members and the tension members are stabilized members, maybe it affects the residual stresses.
It does not affect the residual stresses. I'm not saying why is the compression members affecting the residual stresses. Residual stresses are present. Now, why are their compression capacities getting affected but not their tension capacity? Gurucharan, Kelvin? Sorry, Kelvin is the first name. Kelvin?
Sir, I cannot give an answer.
No,
Not
Kelvin,
very
that is not acceptable. You have to say something. Please try.
I think the compression members, the residual stress affect the local buckling in the member basically.
Okay.
Rather than
Local
tension.
buckling, you're saying. Okay. Now, local buckling effect is separate. I'm going to discuss that primarily today. We'll talk about that. And residual stresses can interfere with that, but even without the residual stresses, there is a play. Okay. Krishnan Katyan.
Sir, I'll say in this way, due to residual stresses, there is already compression. So once you start applying compression, the fibers will reach compression yield faster. But
Yes.
in case of tension, it is not that case. They have that reserve to go till the.
So if I apply tension, won't it happen that some of the fibers will reach tension yield first or early?
So, but I have much more reserve in strain hardening, no sir.
No, strain hardening anyway, don't account for it. Strain hardening, fine. Strain hardening is there, but we account for strain hardening only when we talk about rupture. We don't account for strain hardening when we are talking about the gross yielding. Right? So at least for gross yielding point of view, we should have considered that or not considered that. Then we should have done the same thing in both cases. Leo?
I'm not sure what's that.
No, Leo, say something. I want to basically see what is the level of understanding and thinking. So please.
My only things like in the tension members, there's no chance of any buckling. There's only tensile nature. But in case of compression member, there is like buckling is the major thing like coming in that compression member.
Yes. So how is residual stress causing buckling?
So in residual stress causing buckling means due to the variation yielding fibers like due to the CTC pattern as load.
CTC pattern, compression tension compression pattern.
Yeah, CTC pattern. When some load applied, some of the fibers will be yield fast, and some of the puff yielding like that. Some process games. The effective modulus, Young's modulus will become 0 for some of the fibers, and so that it's greatly affecting the load carrying capacity of the compression members. But when come to
so why should E affect the load carrying capacity of compression members?
So actually P it's according to P equal to pi square A by is
exactly. See, Leo, you are saying that you don't know the answer, but when we break that problem into smaller problems, then you were able to answer the question. Good job, Leo. So, and I think Lohit also was like, in very couple of sentences, he had already answered the question. So I didn't let him answer the entire question. Otherwise, he might have So anybody else wants to try? I mean, Leo has done a good job. I'm going to not repeat it.
Thank you.
I'll repeat it anyway, but let me see who else can try. Pujita, you want to try? If you are able to follow what Leo said and what Lohit had said, I think you should be able to.
Yes, sir. Actually,
Louder, please. Louder, please. We can't hear you.
sir,
Or bring the microphone closer to your mouth.
yes, sir. Can you hear me?
It's still very, very soft. You need to bring the microphone closer.
Yes, sir. I bought microphone.
Yeah, now we
Close.
can hear you. Now we can hear you.
Yes, sir. Actually, minor axis is already a weaker axis, and this residual stresses being concentrated very near to the minor axis, it contributes to buckling very easily rather than the ideal conditions, sir. So in compression, we need to consider this residual stresses, but in tension, buckling is not a criteria. The failure might take place only after yielding of all the fibers. So I think that's why we don't consider.
Yeah, I think now you guys are getting a hang of it. So I'm not going to keep asking more people to answer it. Fine. So I'll just quickly repeat. So compression members are susceptible to buckling, but tension members are not susceptible to buckling. That is established, right? Everybody agrees with that at least, because tension is a stabilizing force, but compression is a destabilizing force. Now, the buckling behavior is governed by one material property. If I'm talking about elastic buckling, which material property is it governed? Is it governed by? Shayan? Shayan,
yes, sir.
Which material property is the buckling behavior governed by? Material property that governs the buckling behavior or buckling capacity.
Slenderness ratio.
No. Pujita, it's not slenderness ratio. Shayan, you want to try? Material property, not the cross-section property.
Material.
There are only 2 or 3 material properties that we have talked about so far.
Young's modulus.
Yes. Young's modulus. Yeah, so Young's modulus governs the buckling behavior and yield stress governs the yielding behavior. These are the 2 primary modes of failure, right? So it is the Young's modulus. Now what is happening because of residual stresses is that the effective Young's modulus. So you can think of the effective Young's modulus of the cross section. So you may have a Young's modulus of that is measured from a coupon, but also there is an effective Young's modulus of the cross section. Now, because of the residual stresses that are present as you apply compression, some of the fibers yield, and effective Young's modulus decreases. Same thing happens in tension also. So as you apply tension, some of the fibers yield, and the effective Young's modulus decreases. Okay, but a decrease in the effective Young's modulus in tension members does not change anything for the member. So let it be a little bit more flexible. So member becomes slightly more flexible, but still until the entire cross section yields, it still has sufficient stiffness and there is no buckling issue. So Young's modulus does not control the overall failure behavior. But for compression members, when your effective elastic modulus or Young's modulus has decreased, that starts to trigger buckling early. Okay, because at a lower load itself, the member starts to buckle, and that's why residual stresses become important for compression members, but not so much for tension members. Okay, I hope you were able to follow it. That is a very important question, and if you cannot answer this question, then that obviously means that you have not understood this portion of the course properly. Okay, the assignment that you are working on currently is exactly focusing on this aspect of it. Okay. So residual stresses we have discussed in detail. Imperfections we had developed a formulation, and that also points us to the current provisions that are there in the Indian code, how the imperfection effects are incorporated. Okay. Then the third effect that I have talked only briefly about is the local buckling effect. Okay. So local buckling effect actually we have discussed briefly. When a member undergoes local buckling, this is how typically it looks like. So you can see in this beam, the flange has buckled locally, and only one side of the flange has buckled because it was, even if it was subjected to compression, typically it will be combined with some kind of a buckling. And when the buckling happens, one side is in compression, the other side is not in so much of a compression. So in the direction that it buckles, that's where you are likely to see some kind of a local buckling happening. Same thing you can see here. Okay. So local buckling is a phenomenon that depends on, again, one material property. Which material property is it that governs local buckling? Shayan?
The slenderness ratio.
Material property.
Then
Slenderness is not a material property.
Young's modulus.
Young's modulus, yeah, same answer.
Yes, sir.
So yes, so it is the Young's modulus, elastic modulus, that governs all kinds of buckling. Okay. When you get into torsion, then you get into issue of warping, and then the elastic modulus and shear modulus both start to play a role. Other than warping, so like there the shear modulus starts to play a role. But anyway, the idea is that stiffness related material properties will govern the buckling behavior. Okay. So one is material property. There will be some cross-sectional properties also that will govern local buckling behavior. So when we are talking about local buckling behavior, which cross-section properties would control? Pujita, we have gone through. Okay. So Nikhileshwar, which cross-section property would govern the local buckling behavior? We can't hear you. Your microphone is not working, it seems. Can you type your message or with your response in the chat box? You can type your response here. Which cross-sectional property will govern the local buckling behavior? I don't see anything yet. Not working. Okay, microphone is not working, but can you type at least? Which cross-section property will govern the local buckling behavior? Web cross-sectional, okay. Yeah. Is it working now, Nikhileshwar? Or somebody else? Dipsy, I think it is getting. I'm muting you, Dipsy. Nikhileshwar, can you elaborate more? Web cross-sectional what? So any of these cross sections are made of plates, right? So it is an I section is made of 2 flanges and 1 web. So which cross section property? We are still waiting, Nikhileshwar. Sairaj, you want to try?
Yes, sir. Sir, can we say like width to thickness ratio? Does that will?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Exactly. So
Yes,
width to thickness ratio, and also depending on which type of element it is. If it is a web versus
Yes, sir.
flange, and if it is a C-section flange versus a or C-section channel sections web versus an I sections web, and so on.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So because that will control the boundary conditions.
Yes, sir.
And also whether it is welded or hot rolled. So if it's a rolled section, it will have a more rigorous kind of a the boundaries will be stiffer. But if it's
Yes,
a welded section, then boundaries may not be as stiff.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So yes. So basically, what happens is that, let me see if I can draw. Let's say if I have an I section. So this is a rolled I section. Okay, so if the web had to buckle, sorry, if the flange has to buckle, this flange has to buckle locally, right? So it will be buckling in somewhat like this. So if this part of the flange does not buckle, only this part of the flange buckles. Depends on how the stresses are distributed. So it will probably, this line would not change its location. So this point won't move, this entire line won't move. What will move is only this flange. So this, some portions of it will go up, go down, and some portions will go up. And you will have this kind of a wavy wave forming. Okay. Got it? So this will be local buckling of this flange. Okay. So that depends on which properties does it depend on? It depends on, so imagine if this is your plate and it is fixed here at this end, and then you subject it to compression in this direction, because this is the entire cross section is in compression in this direction, right? So it is likely to buckle this way, and this edge is fixed. It won't move vertically at this edge. So at this edge the movement is 0, B is equal to 0, but at this edge it is non-zero. Okay, and that's why you will have a buckling. So it depends on this kind of a boundary condition, and usually the plate can be assumed to have this kind of square cross section of sorts, and then you can define different types of buckling modes. So one can be half wave, another one can be two half waves, or one full wave, or something like that. Similarly, but when the web has to buckle, this is the web plate, let's say. Here at both ends it is probably fixed, so the top edge as well as the bottom edge, they cannot move laterally. Lateral movement is restrained. Okay, and also depending on the stiffness that is provided by this fillet, right? Whatever this extra thickness we have, it may be providing some rotational stiffness. So even the rotation may be restrained. Okay, these rotations at the two ends may be restrained. So then in this kind of situation, the web has to buckle. If it has to buckle, it has to buckle in this double curvature mode, right? Otherwise, if these ends were not restrained against rotation, the web would have buckled simply like this, right? But instead of that, the web has to buckle like this. So these boundary conditions play a very important role. Fine. So the boundary conditions matter, elastic modulus matter. So the boundary conditions matter, elastic modulus matters, and B by T matters. So by B by T, it will be known as different quantities. In general, I'm just calling it B by T. So for a web, it will be this depth, and approximately, for a rolled section, you will take a slightly different depth. For a welded section, you will take only the middle depth. So this will be B, and this will be T. So B by T. Similarly, for a flange, only half a flange would buckle typically on one side. So you will look at, this is the flange. So you will look at something like this will be B, and this will be the T value. Okay, so this B by T will play a role in governing what is the buckling resistance of a section. Now, different components. So there are two flanges and there is a web. Likewise, you may have a channel section where you may have two flanges and a web, or angle section. So uneven, unequal leg angle or equal legged angle, whatever. So if it is unequal legged angle or a channel section or an I section, what may happen is that the flange may buckle, but the web may not buckle, or the web may buckle and the flange does not buckle. So you have to check that none of the three or none of the plates that the cross section is made of should buckle. So if either one buckles, then that is the one that is governing the local buckling behavior. So none of the plates should buckle. The one that buckles first will govern the behavior. The local buckling behavior, sorry. Okay. Now coming back to this one. So if a column had to buckle in typical flexural buckling that we have been talking about till the last class, then this is how the deformed shape of a column will look like. The column was straight to start with, like here it was straight to start with, but because of buckling, the column bends completely. However, in case of a local buckling, the entire column does not bend. It's only one component. It could be one of the plates. So it could be the flange or it could be the web that buckle locally. And that is called local buckling. Now the approach the Indian code takes to design against local buckling is not similar to the approach that it takes against flexural buckling. So for flexural buckling, we know what is the capacity of a cross section, right? For an elastic flexural buckling, we know it is given by Euler's buckling equation. It is pi square EI by L square. And similar kind of equations can be derived for individual components also, for a component buckling. But the Indian code does not give you any such equations. It does not ask you to design for a local buckling limit state. You have all taken the courses at earlier levels, and this is not just the Indian code, even foreign codes also for regular steel design. I'm talking about structural steel design, not the light gauge steel design. I'm talking about regular structural steel design. None of the codes in the world actually ask you to or expect you to design for local buckling. That is, it does not give you the capacity against local buckling. Okay, so local buckling is not a limit state. Then how do we handle this issue? How do we avoid the issue of local buckling in the Indian code? You have all taken this course in undergraduate level, so you should be able to answer. Who wants to try? Lohit, you want to try?
Sir, I mean, local buckling depends upon various parameters, sir. So to give the capacity for that, it may be a tedious process. So instead of that, what they did is, I mean, by controlling the width to thickness ratios, then we can limit the local buckling. Or instead, if we can't limit the thickness ratios, then what can we do is we can reduce the capacity of the member. In that way,
Yeah, good. Good. Anybody else wants to explain? Harish, I think, had unmuted himself. Harish?
As per IS 800, we will classify the sections now, sir.
Yes.
By that, we can arrest the local buckling initially at the section classification itself.
Yes. Yes. So, yeah, both of them are correct. I'll elaborate. See, what the approach that the international codes, including the Indian code, the approach that they take is for structural steel design is that we don't want local buckling to happen before the yielding happens or before the global buckling happens. Okay. So global buckling and yielding are both acceptable, and for them you can design. But we don't want the local buckling to trigger before any of those things happen. So for that purpose, what they have said is that, let's say, okay, let me give you a hypothetical case. And remember that this is a hypothetical case. This is not how the provisions work. But let's say those who are writing the codes wanted everybody to design columns in such a way that columns would only fail in yielding and not fail in buckling. Or columns will not. So columns have to be designed so that all the columns in the world, all the steel columns in the world, they will fail only in yielding and not in buckling. Then what would have they done? So they had this kind of an equation that they could have developed, but then they wanted to make sure that none of the columns fail in buckling, only in yielding. Then what they could have specified. How would you approach that? So if I want you to design a column that does not buckle, if it has to fail, it has to fail only in yielding. What would you do?
Stocky column, design a stock. We'll make
So design it as a stocky column. What would you do? You will limit the lambda value, right? So you will keep, so this up to this point, you are sure that it is primarily up to something like 0.2 or 0.3, you can say almost. It is primarily a yielding kind of a failure. Beyond that only, beyond a lambda value of 0.3 or something, then you start getting into the possibility of buckling, or the limit or the capacity is governed by buckling beyond that on, right? So I would have said, okay, keep the lambda value below 0.3 or keep the lambda value below 0.2. So if you had to make a column that is something like 6 meters tall, the column will also be almost like 1 meter wide. Okay, steel column of that size. But that's what it would have been. Okay, but we did not go that way. These people were smart enough, and they said, okay, we don't care. We are okay to accept. We are fine with buckling failure mode also, and we will design for it. So we will calculate if this is the length of the column. This will be the buckling resistance of the column, and we will make sure that we don't apply that much of load, and that's how we design. Okay, so for global buckling, we take this approach, but for local buckling, we take the approach that I had just discussed. We will limit the slenderness value to a particular level. So for a column, we found a factor called lambda, and for the entire member, we found a factor called lambda that is governing the buckling behavior of the column, and that we are limiting to a particular value, which already incorporates all the material effects, all the geometry effects, boundary effects, everything is already fed into lambda, right? And we limit a particular lambda, we could limit a particular lambda value to make sure that it fails under yielding. But that is exactly what is done when it comes to local buckling. So in local buckling, what we say is that if you want to use any cross section in Indian, as per the Indian code, and likewise the approach is there everywhere. If you want to use the cross section and you want to use IS 800 for designing that member, you have to make sure that it does not locally buckle before it yields. Okay, that means, so if I take a member like this and I apply compressive force, if I take a plate rather, if I take this plate and there are some boundary conditions, so these two edges represent some boundary conditions. I'm not giving more details on this boundary conditions. This is a generic plot. It's not exact plot. So if you had a plate, you apply uniform compression on this, and whatever boundary conditions you can assume this to be fixed, this to be free, or free, or fixed fixed. Then at some point this plate will buckle. Okay, and this plate could be your web, or it could be the half flange or something. So the code says, or like the actual behavior is that if you keep applying some load, if the plate is thin in comparison to its width, B by T, right? So if T is very small in comparison to its width, then the plate is more likely to buckle even before it reaches the yield point. If it is sufficient, this B by T is sufficiently small. So if B by T is too large, you will have this kind of a failure where it will locally buckle. The plate will buckle before it reaches the yield point. If it is sufficiently small or not too large, then it will just reach the yield point and then buckle. Okay. If it is really thick, then there is a way that you can go into sufficient plasticization of the cross section. Okay, so you can develop some amount of plastic strain and then it will buckle. Also, you can make it really, really stocky, that is very small B by T ratio. And for such cases, you can go to plastic limit. So that is called a plastic cross section, where you can apply a very large plastic strain. Not only that, you can apply that kind of strain in reversible also. So you can reverse the cycle and apply the load again, and still it will keep behaving as a plastic cross section. Okay, and will not undergo local buckling for a very large strain. So such kind of four classifications are done in the Indian code. The plastic classification is usually required only for seismic design or when you go into plastic design approach. So plastic design approach is not really applicable here. We are not covering that. So when you do spatial moment resisting frames, or when you do plastic design kind of requirement, there you need the you need to meet the requirements of plastic cross section. Other than that, typically we deal with only slender, semi-compact, and compact. Actually, I had stolen this picture from the internet. So in the US, I think they call it non-compact. So that's why the terminology here was non-compact. In India, we call it semi-compact, but the idea is same. So slender, semi-compact, and compact. These are the three important classifications. Plastic is another one, but plastic we will need to use only when we go for plastic design. So there is a section of steel design, which is plastic design, right? So where you assume the hinges to have been formed, and then you design based on that capacity. We are not covering that. Also, there is a possibility of slender section. So slender sections are prohibited if you are going to use IS 800. Okay, either it is prohibited, or what Lohit had mentioned briefly is that assume that a portion of the cross section is not going to be utilized. So let's say your B by T turns out to be 100, or sorry, 100 is too large. Let's say your B by T turns out to be 15, and the code says that B by T cannot be more than 10 for it to be semi-compact. If it is more than 10, then it is not semi-compact, it is slender. Then what do? Either you can say that this cross section or this plate cannot be used in this member as per IS 800. That is a perfectly acceptable approach. Typically, that is what we do. But the code also gives you a way out. What it says is that, okay, if you have got B by T that is equal to 15, but you can use only up to B by T equal to 10, what you can do is you take only sufficient width of this cross section of this plate so that the width that you take into account divided by T remains up to 10. And you discard the remaining thickness, remaining width of the plate and ignore it as if it was not there. Okay. It does not give enough detail, and I really doubt whether that is a good approach or not, or whether that can actually prevent the local buckling. But anyway, that's what the approach the code gives. So you can take liberty and you can use it, but generally the approach is not to go into that and simply keep the B by T within the limits of semi-compact. So for a plate to be used as a column member, so whether a web dimensions are concerned or flange dimensions are concerned, we need to have at least a semi-compact behavior. Okay. So here, this table number 2, if you go to IS 800, yeah. So here for different cross sections, so for example, a I-beams web, it gives D definition, what is D and what is TW. Similarly, for a channel, this is the H, this is TW. So you need to take H divided by TW. Likewise, for a flange, the definition of B is not the full width, but half of the width of the flange, but not from here, not from the corner or the fillet location, right from the middle of the web. Okay, so that's how these dimensions are defined: D by TF, D by TW, and so on. And then, which kind of cross section it is? So a flange in an I section will be called an outstanding element of a compression flange. So if you have an I section under compression, then the flange will be outstanding element. Internal element of a compression flange, when will it be an internal element of a compression flange? So you may have an I section typically. Sometimes you may have some kind of stiffeners that are going this way to provide it additional lateral restraint. So then this one, this is not an outstanding compression flange, it's an internal compression flange. Sorry. And this one is an outstanding compression flange. Okay. In case of an I section, and here also, this is also an outstanding compression flange. Got it? So that is the definition of outstanding element, internal element of a compression flange. Then you may have a web situation. So if it's a web of an I or box girder, so this can be, this is the web of an I section, or you may have a box. So this is the web. So for webs of I, H or box section, if it is under pure axial compression, that is the chapter we are on right now, right? Pure axial compression, then it does not matter whether it is plastic or compact. These are the two limits. Class 1. Plastic and compact. So these two don't matter. What matters is it is semi-compact at least. So at least it has to satisfy the limit of 42. Right? So basically, for it to be compact, the d by tw of the web should be less than 42 for it to be semi-compact at least. Okay. Similarly, so if you see for a web, it is 42, and similarly for an internal flange, compression flange, it is also 42 because the boundary conditions are very similar. Okay. Under pure axial compression. Outstanding element, the number is very small. It is 15.7. So B by TF is 15.7, whereas this is, if it is an internal element, then the B by TF is 42. So the allowed value is 42. That is, it can be much more slender. And the reason obviously is the boundary condition. So this is almost like a cantilever projecting outward, right? This is outstanding flange. So like a cantilever, under compression, it can buckle very easily. Whereas this kind of a member or this kind of a flange, which is an internal flange, right? This is not that easy to buckle because it gets restrained from this side as well as this side. So because of that, the values here and here are very different. Plus for welded sections, if you see, the corresponding values are all even further smaller, okay? Which means that you need to be more strict with welded sections because they are more likely to buckle. Fine. So if it turns out to be a non-slender section, then you can take the entire cross-section area, even the area that is covered through holes, like if there is some plates which have holes, but there is a rivet or bolt or a pin inside that hole, then you can count that area also as a part of the cross-section. But if there is a hole which does not have a rivet sitting inside or a bolt sitting inside, that means that hole cannot be accounted for, that cross-section area cannot be accounted for. Okay. So as far as compression members are concerned, we only need to worry about semi-compact condition. And there is this factor epsilon, right, which is equal to square root of 250 by Fy. What it basically means is that for a steel that has a yield stress of 250, your epsilon value will be equal to 1. Correct? So then you don't have to make any changes. But for high strength steel, what will happen to your limits here? For high strength steel, your values, all the numbers there, will they increase or decrease? In table 2, there are several numbers given, right? So when you have high strength steel, let's say the yield strength is 350 instead of 250, then will those numbers effectively increase? The B by TF limits will increase or decrease?
Obviously it will decrease now.
Sir, decrease, sir.
Decrease, right? So
Yes,
what does that mean physically? It means that if you could have used a thin plate, let's say a plate with the ratio of, let's say, 15 or 20, B by T ratio of 20, as an element for in a cross section for regular mild steel. For higher strength steel, you have to make thicker cross sections. You cannot go to the similar limits of B by T like you could go with 250 steel. So if you increase the strength of your steel, your elements in the cross section has to be stockier and stockier. You follow me? That is counterintuitive, right? So the idea of going for high strength steel is so that we can make slender members, right? We could use thinner plates and make very elegant, very slim structures. But this particular provision says that if you go for higher strength steel, the plates that you can use to make your sections, whether it is welding or whether you are hot rolling, the plates that the cross section is constituted of, those plates, B by T has to decrease. That is, its stockiness has to increase, right? So either you increase the thickness or you reduce the width of that kind of a plate, right? Does it make sense? Does it sound intuitive or is it counterintuitive? Why do we do that? Somebody other than Lohit, maybe. Why is this epsilon value there? Sairaj, actually you answered the last question. Prithvi, what is the role of epsilon here?
Sir, it is actually it gives the local. The buckling feature of um, the elements over there, like it's flange or a web. So it gives it gives that ratio will gives whether it is going to buckle or not.
Then so why should high strength steel members or elements should be stockier?
Sir, maybe they are less ductile.
No, Harish. Prithvi, you want to add something or?
Yeah, generally, so high strength members are generally the failure of high strength are governed by the fractures rather than the yielding.
No. So I'm not talking about that kind of a high strength. Even from 250 to 350, the ductility does not change drastically. So I'm not talking about that kind of a change in. I'm not talking about like 800 MPa steel, which is not as ductile. Shayan?
Sir, maybe
The answer
to that.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Sir, maybe due to the factor of safety or something.
No. Okay. Tekeshwar Rao?
Sir, no idea.
No idea. Beautiful answer.
I'm thinking, sir, but
okay. See, answers are all there. I mean, why is that epsilon sitting there? And why is this formula, the expression for epsilon has 250 already hard-coded into it. So 250 corresponds to 250 MPa steel, right? So 250 is hard-coded. For other steels, you have to, for 250 steel, you don't have to do anything. Epsilon is 1. But for other steels, you need to change that. And if you have a higher strength steel, then epsilon becomes smaller. That means your B by T limits become smaller, or D by T limits become smaller. Lohit, you want to give it an answer now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Consider two cases, sir. I mean, one case there is a 250 MPa steel, another case there is a 500 MPa steel. For the same load, the 250 MPa steel will give the higher dimensions. I mean, it gives a more cross-sectional area. I mean, in terms of width or thickness. But when it comes for 500 grade of steel, it will give the less area compared to that of the 250 steel. So that means the thickness of the plate or the width of the plate compared to the 250 plate will be less. Will be less.
No. Okay, so you are trying to explain the economy side of it, and that's not the question.
No, sir. I mean, the thickness will become so. As a result, the B by T ratio will be much lesser than that of the 250 SL. So that's why they are imposing this. Okay, you should be maintain minimum thickness so that it won't undergo local buckling or subjected.
I think you have taken quite a kind of a convoluted argument, so I was not able to follow the whole thing. But the last couple of sentences you said were fine. Okay, so the idea is, first of all, you should understand why are these numbers there? What are they enforcing? What are they enforcing? Why is this table there? So this limit of semi-compact for compression members have to satisfy this limit of semi-compact at least. They should not be slender. So beyond this, you have slender. So if you're, for example, for a internal compression flange, if the B by TF value exceeds 42, you go into slender range. As long as it is under 42 or smaller than 42 B by TF, you are in non-slender range. So it could be semi-compact, compact, plastic. So what is this 42 limit doing? Vishal, what is this 42 limit doing?
Sir, restricting it to within semi-compact or compact or plastic.
Yeah, that I just said that.
Yes.
But by doing this, what it is trying to do to the cross section in terms of failure mode?
Because once it goes to slender, it will be more susceptible to local buckling than it will be semi-compact.
So 42 is trying to avoid
local buckling
and encourage
yielding failure, sir.
Yielding, yes. So these numbers that are there, they are making sure that if you are satisfying, let's say semi-compact is primarily our interest right now. So if you're satisfying this limit, we are within this limit, that means we are avoiding local buckling or we are making sure that yielding happens before local buckling takes place. Okay. Now, if you go for a higher strength steel, when you go for a 350 steel or 400 MPa steel, does your local buckling strength change? So if I have a plate, same dimensions, 250 MPa steel, 350 MPa steel, the local buckling strength of the two plates, will they be different?
No.
Elastic buckling strength of two plates, one is 350 MPa, another one is 250 MPa. Will their local buckling strength be any different?
No.
The same cross section.
No, sir.
Same cross section, same E value, right? So as you increase the strength of steel, its E value does not change. Agreed? Elastic modulus cannot be increased by increasing the Fy value. And because of that, the local buckling strength has not changed. What has changed is its yield stress. So now a cross section with 250, you had satisfied this limit of 42, you are exactly sitting at 42 or maybe 40 or 41.9 somewhere. So you are making sure that it will yield before it buckles. But now you go to higher strength steel. Now Fy has shot up. So it will not yield at that point. But buckling is still at the same level because its E value has not changed. So now the cross section that was earlier going to yield rather than buckle will not be yielding before buckling. It will be buckling before yielding. And therefore, this number 42 has to be brought lower. So the geometry has to be made stockier of that plate. And that's why this epsilon value. Okay. Now you followed it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Fine. So there are a couple of other slenderness limits. We have discussed this in the past. So for Fy is equal to 250, they correspond to these limits. So see, the thing is, they should give you an idea of what lambda values you can use. So typically a lambda value of between 2, so almost like for any member that can be subjected to compression, a lambda of 2 is pretty much the upper limit. Now you come here, lambda of 2 is sitting somewhere here. So at lambda of 2, how much of the cross-section capacity can you utilize? Almost like not even 10%, maybe 5%. Right? There are the curves. So at lambda is equal to 2. Sorry, my bad. I had not plotted that carefully here. So at lambda is equal to 2, you can utilize something between 20% almost to 15% of the cross-section capacity. Yeah, but typically that is the limit on lambda of the cross-section. Your KL by R is limited to 180. Okay, and if it is only once in a while it goes into compression because of only wind or earthquake, then it is limited to lambda of 2.81. Okay. That means only somewhere here, right? Around this place, 2.8. That means you can use almost 10% of the cross-section capacity. The columns are very, very slender already. So that's why approximately KL by R up to 250, you have the values available because that's the upper limit of any member that can undergo compression. If you go to tables 8 and 9 in the Indian code, you will see that you don't have any table after KL by R of greater than 250. There is an example I have solved. This is basically taken from the textbook, so you can go through it. I'm not going to repeat this example. It's a straightforward example. This must have been the first example that you solved as a BTech student in this course. Okay, so what's the time now? I think I have 20 minutes. We can initiate this discussion and then we will do an example in the next class. Okay. So the issue now with whatever we have discussed so far is that you have to use these equations ultimately, and for us to be able to use these equations, column capacity equations, you can call this equation, you can use this nice formula, either one you do. So either you can use the formula or you can use this chart or you can use this table that are tables 8 and 9. What happens is that in order to use this equation, you need to calculate lambda. For that, you need to calculate KL. right? What is KL? Effective length, right? Effective length, table 11.
Yes, sir.
This one. So this gives you how to calculate, this table gives you how to calculate the effective length of the member. Right? So these factors of effective length factor 2, 1, 1.2, 0.8 and so on are given. The issue is that these kind of boundary conditions can be okay for trusses maybe, but for typical buildings, these kind of boundary conditions are not directly applicable. There are challenges. Because in buildings, typically columns and beams are not connected the same way the members in a truss are connected. So if you have a bridge truss or if you have a pole, then these kind of boundary conditions guidelines may be sufficient, right? But not in a building. Why not in a building?
So it's rigid connections.
Yes, very good. See, what happens is that typically in a building, you will have some kind of a rigidity that is provided between the beam and the column. Okay? So the beams are connected with some level of rigidity to the columns. And because of that, when a column or when any member, primarily column that is in compression, then when it wants to buckle, its ends want to rotate. Okay? Now, the beams that are connected to that column, so you have a column and there are beams connected to it. Now, when this column wants to buckle, its ends wants to rotate, both ends want to rotate, the beams will be offering certain level of restraint. It is not a full restraint, right? And it's not also a pin condition. Typically, when you have an angle with this one bolt or something or two bolts, you can assume what kind of K value to take. You can take, or you can give it some level of partial fixity. But when you have a beam versus a column and the two things are joined together as a rigid connection, then the joint itself does not have much of a flexibility. The joint might be rigid, but the beam offers some flexibility. So the beam is not rigid. Therefore, when this column wants to buckle, for it to be able to buckle, it has to rotate the beam end slightly. Okay. So if I have a column, okay. So if I have a column which is connected to beams, okay, and then there, of course, there are other columns here. I'm just showing them as supports. And this column, this intermediate column we are interested in, this is the column that wants to buckle or this about to buckle. Now, when it wants to buckle, if these beams are absolutely rigid, very stiff, then they can make the column go this way. Okay. Then you can design the column as a fixed end column and you can take the K value accordingly. The K value for that is almost 0.6 or something in the Indian code. Yeah, 0.65. Okay. So 0.65 L you can take, but for that the beams have to be very, very rigid. Okay. Alternatively, if you have a pin connection, you have this column, you have this beam, and the connection here between the beam and the column at both ends is pin. Okay. Then the column can very nicely buckle in a single mode, in the single curvature mode. Okay. I'm just drawing the hypothetical or some kind of assumed shape above and below, but primarily you should focus on this story. So this column can buckle very easily, and then you can take K of 1. Here you can take K of 0.65. But often you don't have this option or this option available. Often what you have is this connection is a rigid connection between beam and column. This connection is also a rigid connection. But the beam itself is not rigid. It is flexible. So when this column wants to buckle now, okay, it will make this beam also bend. It will make this beam also bend. Or in other words, when this column wants to buckle, this beam will resist it. This beam will resist the buckling of this column and this beam as well. Similarly, this beam also will resist the buckling of this column and this beam as well. Okay. So then these members, the neighboring elements, start to play a role and they start to affect the buckling capacity of this member or the effective length of this member. So has this chapter been covered in the advanced concrete design course? The frame slenderness class. Have you seen charts like these already? Are you guys there?
No, sir.
No, sir.
This
Not
has
yet.
not been discussed so far? Not yet.
Not yet in ARC.
Okay, so when you get, because they might be focusing still on the concrete, whatever the stress block, etc. So when they go to slender columns, then this discussion will come up. So I think that might be covered a little bit later. So good that you will have some exposure before you go into that chapter. This kind of a problem is not very common with steel. So that's why this chapter is put in the annexure. But I think in IS 456, it is part of the main code. I have forgotten actually. In the ACI code, it is part of the main code only. But in the American code, in concrete, I'm not sure about IS 456. I have not seen that code in a while. Anyway, so but here, this particular chapter is placed not in the main code. The reason for that is that in steel, it is very common, or it is rather relatively common to have this kind of an arrangement, where beam to column connection in most of the places is not rigid, but it is pinned. So you may provide 2 or 3 bolts. So in such cases, the typical beam to column detailing will be somewhat like this. You would have an angle. Okay. The angle will be bolted to the column flange or welded to the column flange, and your beam will be coming here. And then it will be, the web of the beam will be bolted to this angle. Okay. So in this kind of an arrangement, since only the web is connected to the column, web of the beam is connected to the column, the rotation is almost allowed. So the restraint against rotation is very little. So that won't happen until you connect the flanges also. So flanges are not connected directly to the column, and therefore you can have almost a pin kind of a connection. So this is almost like a pin connection. On the other hand, you can have a rigid connection. Wherein there can be various kinds of details. One commonly used detail is not used so much in India. In America, it is very commonly used. Is that you bring the beam all the way to the column, and you have to be careful about the fixities or the fittings. So you bring it up to here. This clearance is very small, even though it is exaggerated here. So then both flanges are welded to both flanges of the beam are welded to the column directly, or sometimes you may weld them with some kind of a stiffener or something. And then in addition to that, you put an angle which will be either welded or bolted to the flange as well as the web of the beam. So this kind of an arrangement is rigid connection. This kind of a rigid connection is provided seldom in steel construction, but in concrete, that is almost all connections are always rigid connections. Therefore, this particular chapter becomes more relevant for concrete. In steel too, sometimes you do this kind of a connection, and therefore you have this kind of an issue that you have to address, where the effective length becomes more complicated, and that's why this chapter is there. Okay. Now, for this discussion, you have to understand that there can be 2 types of frames. One type of a frame is a non-sway frame or braced frame, wherein at story level, the columns or the floors are not moving laterally. That means if you look at the buckling of possibility of a buckling of a column, this is one possibility. So at this location, the column cannot move. At this location, the column cannot move. It can only rotate at these locations. Okay. So this kind of a position or this kind of a configuration is called braced frame. Why is it called braced frame? Because its lateral movement is restrained, almost effectively restrained, completely restrained. And often you have to provide these braces in order to achieve that. Until you provide these kind of very heavy braces, diagonal braces, or you provide a very, very heavy frame system here, this kind of a lateral restraint cannot be accomplished. Alternatively, another type of a framing system can be the sway framing system. So the first one is non-sway or braced framing system. The other one is sway framing system. So a sway framing system is relatively more flexible against lateral load. So if you apply any lateral load, it will deform more. And there are limits given for this one. So if you go to clause 4.1.2, it prescribes the limits. So you apply some nominal lateral load, the values are given, and then measure or calculate how much will be the lateral drift. So, and if the lateral drift is more than this value, story height divided by 4,000 between two stories, then it is classified as a sway frame. In a sway frame, what happens is that the lateral movement is possible. And in such kind of a situation, your columns are susceptible to buckling, more susceptible to buckling. And then there are different category of effective length factors are applied. You notice here, there are which of these columns in this table would you classify as sway, and which of these would you classify as non or braced or part of a braced frame. The first one here, can you see it? Is it a part of a sway frame or a braced frame?
Sway frame.
Sway frame, right? Second one, oh sorry, this third one rather.
Braced, sir.
Braced. Fourth one.
Sway, sir.
Sway, sir.
Both of these braced.
Braced, yes.
So now if you look at the values for sway frames, you remember 1 and 2. These were 1, 2 and 4 were sway frames. What were the corresponding their K values? 2 and 1.2. Both of them are bigger than 1, larger than 1. For all the braced frames, your K values were 1 or less than 1. Agreed? Right? Yes. So basically, the K value for braced frames are 1 or less than 1, and K values, effective length factor values, for sway frames are 1 or more than 1. And how big can they be?
Not more than 2.
They can be more than 2. Okay. So one possibility could be where it is infinity. Is this column? What is the effective length of this column? This is pinned here. This is pinned here, and the top it is free. Okay. No, see, 2 is for this one.
Yes, sir. Infinity.
This one has K is equal to infinity. This is a sway frame, a column which is a part of a sway frame, and if it is allowed to move laterally until you provide some rotational stiffness here, so you can have this kind of a system. And then on top of that, you can provide some kind of a rotational restraint. So it is not a horizontal movement restraint because it's a sway frame. So horizontally it is free to move, but it cannot rotate. So now if it has to move, it has to move. It can move this way only. Then, or I mean, I'm assuming that it is very, very stiff spring. So laterally it could move easily, but it had to rotate also. And since that rotation was kind of restrained, that's why, so then this K value will be less than infinity. It will not be infinity, it will be less than infinity. And that is, if that spring is very, very rigid, you will get this second case where the K value is taken as 2. But if the spring is very flexible, then K will be equal to, if spring is very flexible. That is same case as this one. Very flexible. Then K value will be equal to infinity. Fine. So in sway frames, your K values can vary between 1 minimum value 1 to maximum infinity.
Infinity.
For braced frames, the value of k can vary between minimum value of what?
0.65.
Yeah, 0.65 as per this table. 0.65 as per this table, but theoretically it is 0.5. Yeah, agreed. Correct. Both answers are correct. 0.5 or 0.65 up to 1. Yeah. So in the next class we will talk about what is the approach that is taken. So for sway frames there is an approach, and so this is for braced frames. So if you look at these values here in this chart, the values vary from 0.5 here in this corner. Yeah, so the minimum value is 0.5 and the maximum value is 0.95 is marked here. So 1 exactly here for a braced frame. But for a sway frame, the values are varying from, it is 1.05 here. So the one before that will be 1, which is not marked, which is obvious. So 1, 1.05, 1.1 and so on, and goes up to infinity. So 5 is marked here, but beyond that is infinity. Okay. All right. And there are ways to calculate it. In the next class, we will discuss this. All right. Any questions? I don't think I have much time left. 3 minutes. Anyway. Any questions?
Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, in the laced columns, if there is a buckling between two laces in the major angle, if there is between the two laces, it be called as local buckling.
Whether we call it a local buckling or not. See, the thing is that, of course, lacing has to be provided at close enough intervals that you don't have that kind of a local buckling. That is, of course, the idea of providing lacings. Now, I mean, should it be called a local buckling? I would not call it a local buckling, but I don't really know what is the terminology used in the industry. Yeah, I mean, see, local buckling, whenever you say automatically, the assumption is people are talking about I mean, at least with the researchers, you should not call it a local buckling, but sometimes industry has different terminologies. I'm not familiar with that. Concept-wise, yes, it can be called local buckling, but if you say that call it local buckling in front of any researcher, they will because local buckling is particularly always to do with the plate buckling in itself.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right then.
So in that local buckling, that table, no, sir.
Yeah.
So in the table, like 42 epsilon, 33.5 epsilon, like that constant value. How they got that, like 33.5, that 42? How they found out that values?
Through experiments. So basically, they took. There are two ways to do it. One is because let's say they are looking at a flange. Sorry, there is that table. That table is much before table 2. Yeah. So usually it is done either through analysis. So let's say we are interested in studying the behavior of a flange. Okay, so outstanding element of a compression flange. So this would be the element of interest. Then what you do is you do some analysis, and then based on whether it is a rolled section or not, whether it's a flange or not, you give the boundary conditions, and then you do some analysis. And from analysis, you will find out at what stress value it buckles. Okay, and you find out that at a particular stress it buckles, and if the ratio of b/2 goes beyond a certain value, that is 15.7, they found out that if it goes beyond 15.7, then it reaches 250 MPa. It buckles even before it reaches 250 MPa. Okay, so then they set it to 15.7, because if you go beyond 15.7, then it will buckle before 250 MPa. So some of these values would be derived, developed through experiments, but then those experimental data will be expanded by using some kind of a numerical technique. And that's what typically research is. So most of the research actually involves doing this kind of a donkey work, where you run through a lot of analysis based on some experimental data. You expand that data by doing some analysis and then trying to find out these limits. So now, I mean, of course, this is at least 30, 40 years old research that has come into the code, but there are many such areas that are being developed. So that's what researchers do typically.
Okay, so thank you.
Okay, fine. So I think I've already taken all the time I could. It's already 5:30. So we will meet in the next class Monday. Okay. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.